Sunsets, yes.
All right, so welcome everybody to our April Lunch and Learn Trauma-Informed Care and Adverse Childhood Experiences. Just a couple of reminders to work with your supervisors for CEUs and filling out that attendance sheet at the conclusion of our series. This is a very interactive presentation, so please feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, drop things in the chat. I'll monitor that chat for you and bring any questions up as they come up. Feel free to also turn on your camera or turn them off if it helps with your connectivity. And just so that you all are aware, we do understand that there is a scheduling conflict for the May series because it interferes with the May Lunch and Learn because it interferes with our breastfeeding curriculum training. And we are working on a solution for that right now. So please stand by and we will we'll work that out so that we don't have to have too many scheduling changes, hopefully, moving forward. Again, please feel free to ask any questions, drop them in the chat, raise your hand, very interactive. And without further ado, Sultana, I'll let you take it away from here.
Good morning. Thanks so much for being with us today. This is actually I was thinking about it. I think this is the 4th time I've done a Lunch and Learn with WIC. I'm so happy to be back. And so this is my second program in this series. We're going to be talking about microaggressions today. And this is an interactive presentation. So if it is possible for you to put on
It looks like you've muted yourself.
Someone else muted me.
Yes, please. If you're hearing any echoing, just I suggest muting yourself or turning off your computer and coming back in.
So if it's possible for you to have your camera on today, that would be really useful. We are going to have a breakout session later where, or a breakout session, I suppose, on here. Did we do this last time too? Uh-oh. Okay, we'll figure this out. We may do this in group together. Sam, we didn't talk about that in our technological run through, but it's these kinds of learning experiences. It is better when we can see each other's faces. There's a lot of things that get lost in tone and lack of being able to see each other, some nuance. So it's possible, if it's possible for you to have your video camera on today, that would be helpful, but it doesn't have to be right this second. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Please don't hesitate to ask questions, raise your hand, etc. I'm happy to answer questions and stop and chat with you. Today is about learning and learning together, so let's learn in the way that we know best. So let's see, I'm just going to share my screen. Give me 1 second while I do this. Thank you for your patience. I am a Luddite. It takes me a little bit longer. All right. So today we are learning a little bit about language and behaviors, and the terminology that's really kind of in use today that we're going to focus on is microaggressions. This is a term that has been around for quite some time. It's really being studied, in more detail today than it has been at any other time, which of course means that our understanding of the word and behaviors that are associated with microaggressions is evolving at a very fast pace. So I just want to preface all of the conversations that we're having today with that knowledge that, the body of science and research that's being done around race, about equity, about the way that we behave in community with one another is constantly evolving. And so please keep that in mind as we're talking today and recognize that what I say today may not be quite as relevant in 5 years, and that we are meant to use this kind of information as a building block, not as kind of our Bible for how we behave or speak with one another in community. So just want to preface what we talk about today with that. I do have some expectations. If you were here at the last Lunch and Learn, this won't be news to you, but if you're new today, one of the things that I just like to preface before we get started is that there are plenty of spaces where folks can debate about the existence or prevalence of racism, sexism, classism, ableism, all those isms and phobias. We don't have space for that today just because our time is limited, and also because I don't think that that's useful for us in learning together. So today we're just going to accept that all of those things exist and that they are so widespread that they impact how we speak and behave with one another, and particularly how we have internalized belief systems about people, groups of people in our communities, particularly groups of people who hold marginalized identities. A couple of other things today. Just have these in the back of your mind as we're talking and thinking and as we're learning together. Defensiveness is a really useful tool. If you're feeling defensive, if something sparks something in you, that is a really useful measurement for you to say, okay, what is it that's making me feel defensive about whatever has been said? It's not an invitation to be an antagonist. It's really just a question to say, okay, what is it that I have something to learn from here? Why do I feel defensive? What is bringing up that feeling in me? I feel defensive all the time. It's an emotion that I am particularly familiar with, and it's a really useful tool to me. So if you're feeling defensive, sit with it, figure out where that's coming from. We're going to stay on track today. All of the things that we're talking about are in relationship to this current social environment that's taking place in our country. So we're not relating it to things that are happening elsewhere in the world. We're not trying to compare what's happening here anywhere else. We're just focusing on what's happening in our communities. We're also going to focus on confronting bigoted behavior and language rather than attacking people or groups of people. And this is really important, I think, especially in the heightened political and social structure that we find ourselves in. We're not going to talk about liberals or conservatives. We're not going to talk about political affiliations. We're not doing any of that. We're really focusing on behaviors and language rather than people or groups of people. We're also really going to try and work, and this is for everyone to really hold deeply, perfectionism and black and white thinking. So believing that there is only one way to talk or think about these things is not useful to us. So we're not going to engage in that today. It actually keeps people from being able to learn and engage with one another. And obviously it doesn't help us change our perspectives or belief systems in any way to think that there's only one route for us to come to different thinking. So we're going to try and leave perfectionism behind and move forward. And although I think that this is really uncomfortable for a lot of people in work settings, I like to say this anyway. I think hope and love are really critical components of any process to try and understand other people or our communities better. And it's really impossible for us to enact change in our work environments, in our social environments, in our families, if we don't have hope and love and belief that change is possible. So because I'm facilitating by myself, I would really appreciate your grace and hope and love in this also. So we're going to get right into it. I'm going to give us about 30 seconds, and I want us to do our best to come up with as complete a definition or as complete an understanding as you possibly can for the word microaggression. So what does it make you think of when you hear the word microaggression? And you don't have to come up with a textbook dictionary definition. I just want you to, as completely as you can, what are all of the things that are encompassed by the word microaggression? And I'm going to give us 30 seconds on the clock. It doesn't have to be a full sentence, just, kind of your thoughts. And I'm going to come back to this, and we're going to throw those at the end of 30 seconds. When I say we're at the end, I'm going to ask you to put those in the chat box. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to engage in some dialogue together. And I am going to ask folks to share. So if you are a brave soul, be thinking about that. I want you to share. And so we're going to, 30 seconds starts now. Be thinking about the completest definition, most complete definition of the word microaggression that you come up with. And if that means you think about the etymology of it, micro, aggression, if that means how you've heard it in context before. Halt. That was 30 seconds. So I am just going to stop my share. And if you can turn on your cameras, now's the time. Thank you so much. I see cameras popping up. I appreciate it. I even see smiles in some of these cameras. That's above and beyond. Thank you. I like that I said I see smiles and someone immediately turned their camera off. They were like, no, that's too much. I can turn my camera on, but I absolutely cannot smile for you today. All right. If you are a brave soul, feel free to unmute yourself. And you don't have to give us everything that you were thinking about, but if you just want to offer some thoughts about what this word made you think of, and also if you have a negative connotation associated with this word, I want to hear that too. Like if not just necessarily like a negative connotation in terms of like, well, microaggressions are bad, but if you've heard the word microaggression over and over again and now it stirs something different in you, I want to hear about that too. But if you've got a definition, be brave. Unmute yourself. Give us a couple words that you had associated with it.
I said intentional and unintentional. It could be on purpose, or maybe you don't even realize that you're doing it. Okay, that's important ones. Intentional or unintentional. So they don't have to be on purpose. Thank you.
I said the first innate adverse reaction to someone or something, like it's your first.
Can you say that again?
It's the first innate adverse reaction to someone or something, like you don't even have time to think about it. It's just your first.
Okay, an innate reaction to someone. Okay, great, thank you.
And mine kind of piggybacks off of what Sam said. My first thought is that it's something that's rooted in racism, xenophobia, sexism, one of the obias or isms, but is like kind of ingrained. So it's not even like a conscious thing. It can be unconscious.
Okay. So rooted in some kind of prejudice, some kind of ism or obia, some kind of prejudice, some reaction, and it could be unconscious or conscious. Anybody else? We're missing some key components. There's one in particular that I haven't heard yet that I think is really important for us to note before we move on. And I'm hoping someone will help us get there. What's the impact?
So I would just offer that my reaction to this word is defensive because it is often used as an accusation towards women's emotions and responses.
That's helpful. So you feel defensive because it is used as an accusation against women's responses. Can you give me an example that this made you think of that?
So, school board meeting that there was, it was used as, almost like this passive aggressive accusation because somebody was having a response that somebody else didn't like to hear. I don't know if that's a good enough example, but.
Yeah. So this has also now kind of become like a catch-all term in some ways. So it had a really specific and purposeful use in science. And now it has also become like an umbrella term in some ways to label behaviors that people are uncomfortable with. Does that accurately reflect what you're saying? I think not dissimilarly to the word gaslight, it had a like very particular usage, and then it started to become used to encompass other behaviors that maybe didn't reflect the initial intention of the word. We're still missing some key parts of the definition. I really appreciate that. Thank you. It was helpful. All right. One thing I didn't hear, microaggressions are harmful. They cause harm. That's a really key and important part of a microaggression, right? They cause harm. And that is really the part that we're going to be talking about today. And then there's another piece of this that I didn't hear, which is that they are daily. So they happen on a daily basis. So there's a cumulative effect, right? So in response to this, that doesn't mean that you're witnessing them every day. It doesn't mean they're happening to you every day necessarily. And I want to come back to this comment about, I really appreciated that you gave us an example also of kind of being used as like a passive aggressive term, like this as a means of being passive aggressive, right? When microaggression, the word, gets used in a context that it is not meant for, it devalues what it actually means, right? Which is that these are harms being perpetrated upon people. And the cumulative effect of microaggressions is so impactful that it has both a mental and physical impact upon marginalized people. So I want to come back to our shared, oh, and let's see. We had some mean speak, form of aggression that a person exhibits without being aware, intentional and unintentional. Thank you. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and we're going to talk about kind of the textbook definitions and then what that looks like in practice. So we're using Dr. Daryl DeWing Sue's definition. He's a professor of counseling psychology at Columbia University. He's one of the pioneers in the study of microaggressions. And microaggressions are, so everyday, daily, verbal or nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults. And they can be intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to people based solely upon being members of a marginalized group. Now, what I think is really important to note here is that there's a really couple of key, really important pieces here. One, daily. Two, verbal or nonverbal. And in this definition, also environmental is important to note here, because when we work, especially when we work in service-related industries, right? Environment plays a really big role. Like if you work at a CAP agency, if you work for a service-related agency, and your environment creates some kind of hostile message to folks, that's important for us to note. And if we're not aware of how that happens, we can't make changes to it. So the other key important part of this, right, is that you have to have some kind of marginalized identity in order to have a microaggression perpetrated upon you. Microaggressions don't happen to people who live and exist solely in power. That's not how this works. So in thinking about that example of how microaggressions was used in a like really passive aggressive way, it would be really interesting to note who was on the receiving end of that and if that person held any marginalized identities. So microaggressions don't live on their own. I really love this graphic. It's from Project Ready, which stands for Reimagining Equity and Access for Diverse Youth. They're a great resource if you're working with young people, just for kind of visual tools. Microaggressions, implicit bias, and stereotypes all kind of create this trifecta, right? All of these things prop each other up. So implicit bias, the belief systems that we have that are encouraged by how we were raised and where we live and the people that we interact with or don't interact with, the media that we consume, et cetera, that bias props up the ways in which we behave, especially negative behaviors with people in our community who may or may not hold marginalized identities, particularly if we don't interact with those people and have personal connections to people who hold those identities. Stereotypes, again, those reinforce implicit bias, which then reinforces our behaviors. So these three things really live together and create scaffolding for behavior that is really hard to interrupt when you don't notice it. There are three types of microaggressions. Again, body of science that is evolving, but right now, Dr. Daryl Dwing-Sue says there are really three types of microaggressions: micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. And micro assaults are kind of, when you think of stereotypically racist behavior, that's a micro assault. So if you're, thinking about somebody yelling out a slur as they're driving past you, or a display of like a swastika or a Confederate flag or something that's really overtly racist, those are micro assaults. They're intentional, they're explicit, and they're trying to cause harm. So that's one group. Micro insults, they're insensitive, they're rude, not necessarily intentional, or, they could be unintentional, but the impact of them is that they demean an identity or a heritage. So a common micro insult would be pointing out how someone is different or the same as a stereotype would indicate. So for instance, if you are a person who is of Asian descent and you're not good at math, pointing out, oh, well, but you're Asian, that's a stereotype that you would be good at math. Why aren't you good at math? That would be a micro insult, right? You are holding Asians to be a monolith. They're all the same. They all have the same experience, and you are different than that. That would be a micro insult. A micro invalidation, it excludes, negates, or nullifies an individual's thoughts or feelings, maybe questions their identity or experience. So it's not quite on the same level as a micro insult, certainly not on the same level as a micro assault, often is unconscious, not intentional. Mistaking people of the same race, if there are three women of color working at a predominantly white organization and people are constantly getting their names mixed up. Or if you choose not to learn how to pronounce someone else's name correctly. Or if someone experiences some kind of racist incident, sexist incident, and instead of just believing that person, you say, are you sure that's what happened? Because it kind of sounds like something else happened. That could be a micro invalidation. So we have a quick scenario, and I'm just gonna, Sam, can we come back to this for a second? Is it possible for us to go into groups?
Yes. How many rooms would you like?
How many folks do we have total?
56, including you and I.
Okay, can we do 5 rooms?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen real quick. I just wanted to make sure that we were on this. If it is possible for you to take some notes or to screenshot when we come back to this scenario, it is very important for you to have your camera on for this group activity. I would also just say that it is very important in these situations when we break out into groups, you get out what you put in. So if you can be engaged and in conversation with your fellow group mates, that is going to be helpful to you. You will learn more from being engaged in this process and being vulnerable and open and having conversation than you will if you don't participate. So we are going to read a scenario, and the point of this exercise is really to be thinking about what is happening in the scenario and to discuss in your group what harms are being perpetuated within the scenario. And I'm asking you to do some deep digging here. And I'm also asking you to withhold judgment about what is happening in the scenario, and just to examine the scenario. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so that we can read through this scenario together. A shopkeeper follows a young Black person around a convenience store. After leaving the store, the young person comes to their after-school program visibly frustrated. They are the only young person there. They throw their backpack to the floor and begin to describe the experience to a staff member with whom they have worked before. The staff member, who is an older white person, first asks the young person to pick up their backpack and hang it up properly before allowing them to continue their story. Then the staff person tells the young person about their own experience being followed around a fancy store as a teenager. When asked by the staff person if they want to work on a piece of writing about the experience for their daily writing session, the young person says no. The volunteer says, "But you've got such a powerful experience to write about," and encourages them to write about it anyway. So we are going to name each of the ways in which the young person of color could have been harmed in this scenario. If there are other ways in which harm has been perpetuated, please name those too. And we're not going to come up with ways the harm could have been addressed. We don't have time to do that today. But I want to remind us, we are not trying to figure out the intention of the people or person who are causing harm. So I don't want you to try and say, well, they might have been trying to do this, but here's what happened instead. That's not what we're doing. We're only trying to figure out the ways in which harm has occurred in this scenario. So if you can take a screenshot or take notes so that you remember what's happened in the scenario, that would be really helpful. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that we can get put into groups. And again, good time to turn on your camera. And I think, how about 7 minutes to get into this discussion? Sam, you're muted.
Perfect. Sorry. I did take a screenshot and put it in the chat here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that. But if you can pull it up, that will be great. I will go ahead and put us into 5 groups, and I'm not sure if I can pull us back. So just reminder, 7 minutes to come back.
I'll start at the clock for 7 minutes.
Great. Meeting rooms. Okay.
Good time to hydrate if you haven't done that yet.
The rooms are opening to just be a minute.
I got kicked out.
Well, let me, what group were you in?
When I went to click join room, it just took me to a blank screen. It didn't let me join.
Okay, let me try again.
That's okay. I'm gonna just wait and let I don't
Okay.
mind waiting here until folks come back.
Okay, great.
Thank you, though.
There's my, yeah, great. I just sent an announcement that we'd be back at 11:35. I think that was right.
Okay. Are you in Portland?
No, I'm in right now I'm in Brooks over by Belfast area, but based out of Augusta for our office.
Gotcha. I'm in Portland right now for the first time in a little while. It's been so nice. And Keeney and I actually rented an Airbnb, which is our.
Oh, fun. Kyle's from Portland, so if you need any recommendations for restaurants, he's the guy to go to.
I actually used to live here, so I'm like having such a good time going to all my old favorite spots.
Oh, awesome. That's so nice.
Bonnie, did you get kicked out too?
My screen went completely black. I could hear, I couldn't, but I couldn't. I went out and went back in. So hopefully I'm not in twice again. But I could hear, but I couldn't see anybody and I couldn't unmute. So I guess I'm unmuted now.
What room were you in? I can try to put you back in.
I have no idea. As soon as you started doing groups, my screen went completely black. I could hear people talking, but I couldn't do anything with my camera or my mute. So I went out and I came back in. So I have no idea what group I was in.
That's okay. We only have another minute and a half left, so you can hang out with us until we get started.
Can you guys, Sam, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay. I'm on my phone and I don't really know how to work it that well because my connection is super, super poor via the computer. And I didn't get moved, so I don't know how that works.
Yeah, it's looking like your phone number and then there's another phone number. I don't think phone numbers got added to the breakout rooms, and I apologize. I didn't know that would happen.
That's okay. I also couldn't see the question. I've been on help desk calls half the morning too. So I'm here. I'm catching it, and it sounds like great discussion and presentation. But I heard someone was from Portland or is visiting Portland. Who is that?
Yeah, it's Sultana. Hi.
Hi, Sultana. How are you?
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the breakout rooms and bring everybody back.
Great, thank you.
Hope that worked and I didn't kick everybody out.
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah.
That was rude. Somebody was talking.
Hi there. How'd we do? Do we have someone from Allison Kelly's group? I just picked a random name. Allison, that I'm not trying to call you out, but Allison Kelly's group, would someone from that group like to jump in and name some of the things that you talked about in your discussion? Allison Kelly, that might be you.
I can report up from group 4.
Yeah, anybody that wants to report out. Let's hear what y'all have to say.
All right, so over in group 4, we had some WIC staff and some public health nursing staff. The things that caused harm, I'm just going to go through our list, or could potentially have caused harm, would have been being followed through the store, putting the backpack down before actually, the backpack situation where the kid had to go hang it up before actually like telling their feelings right then and there. The volunteer going right into their own stories rather than addressing what was affecting that child at that point in time. Being not asked, how did they feel? Not asking how the child felt at that time. Again, going right back into the story. Comparing how one person's story would be equivalent to someone else's story. So just because, you know, you had a similar experience doesn't necessarily take any validation off of that individual that was having that experience at that time. Forcing to write down the things that they didn't want to talk about. Clearly it bothered them, but they were still forced into that situation. And then we also just started to talk, before we got separated, we were starting to talk about age, and how that can actually affect, you know, a kid's perspective on just because I'm young doesn't mean I'm gonna do something bad. So that's where we went.
Great, thank you. Any other groups have things that they talked about that were different that they wanted to mention? All right, I would just want to ask a quick question. In coming back to that triangle visual that I showed y'all about implicit bias, stereotypes, and microaggressions all living together, this scenario, when you were thinking about it, did you assign genders to the people in the scenario? Did your brain supply you? There are no genders in this scenario. There are none. I intentionally did not gender anyone in this scenario. But did your brain fill in for you?
I almost said it. Yeah, I almost said him. I was like, oh, he did not validate the teenager's feelings. But then I caught myself and I was like, oh wait, there's no gender applied. So then I was like, never mind. That's the person.
Yeah, and we don't have to answer this via video, but how many of you thought that the older staff volunteer was a woman? Maybe you could just put that in, if you wanted to put that in the chat, if you had just an X, if you thought the older white staff volunteer was a woman. I'm just curious what the ratio is here. If you thought the older staff person identified as a woman, put a W. If you thought the older staff person was a man, put an M. If you thought they were non-binary, put an NB. Okay, so literally all M's, even though there are no genders in this scenario. Now, did your brain fill in who the young Black person was? Did you also think that that young person was male identified? Young Black male. Did you think that the convenience store owner was a man? So one of the things that's really interesting to note in this is that, and this is not dissimilar, I like to make this connection because I think it's important, right? Is that when the opioid crisis was really starting to gain notice among medical professionals, right? And when doctors were starting to talk about prescribing, over-prescribing as part of one of the contributing factors to the opioid crisis, doctors were asked, you know, do you think that this is a problem? Do you think that doctors over-prescribing opioids are contributing to this problem? And unanimous, like across the board, doctors, once they were confronted with the science and with the data, they were like, oh yeah, we understand how this is a problem, right? Yeah, we get that. And then they were asked, do you think you are a part of the problem? And almost unanimously, they said, well, I don't think I overprescribe. Almost all doctors felt that way, which when we think about that, right, well, some doctors have to be overprescribing, otherwise they're not all contributing to the problem, when in fact, almost all doctors were overprescribing. And so in thinking about this, right, the majority of the people who are on this call, I would say, I'm looking at the cameras, there are a lot of, I would say, femme presenting folks that are on this call who automatically assumed that all of the characters in this scenario were men, which makes it easy for us not to believe that we are contributing in any way to scenarios like this. And I'm only pointing this out because it is an interesting tool in our observation kit to say how our brain fills things in often contributes to our lack of awareness in ourselves about our contributions to these scenarios and problems. So this scenario was actually built off of a very explicit experience that I had while I was volunteering at an organization in Portland. All 3 people in the scenario were women. So I intentionally leave genders out so that we can have this discussion. I think it's fascinating how our brains do such a good job of building pieces of the story for us that then change how we feel about what the story says. And that's really important for us to know about what our role in these scenarios is. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. That was great. Thanks so much. I hope you all had robust conversations in your groups. Let me go back to sharing. And I want to just run us through a couple of things because I think it is coming back to this scenario. So, and I think maybe it's helpful for us to reread this together so that we can be grounded in it again. A shopkeeper follows a young Black person around a convenience store. After leaving the store, the young person comes to their after-school care program, visibly frustrated. They are the only young person there. They throw their backpack to the floor and begin to describe the experience to a staff member with whom they have worked before. So just want to note, they already have a relationship with this staff person. That's really important for us to remember too. The staff member, who is an older white person, first asks the young person to pick up their backpack and hang it up properly before allowing them to continue their story. Then the staff person tells the young person about their own experience being followed around a fancy store as a teenager. When asked by the staff member if they want to work on a piece of writing about the experience for their daily writing session, the young person says no. The volunteer says, but you've got such a powerful experience to write about, and encourages them to write about it anyway. So the shopkeeper's behavior criminalizes this young person on 2 levels. And I'm really grateful that somebody said, talked about age as being a part of this, right? I think it's really easy for us to focus on race when we're talking about microaggressions, even though technically youth is a marginalized identity. Young people have so few rights, so few opportunities to make decisions for themselves, such little agency. And it's really important for us to recognize that ageism, and in both directions, plays a role in microaggressions. So age and race are being criminalized by the shopkeeper. Being asked to pick up the backpack first essentially is telling this young person, order and cleanliness are more important than your feelings. And when we recognize that the young person and the staff member already have a relationship, they have worked together before, it feels even more egregious that they are prioritizing rules and orderliness over comfort and care and compassion and relationship building. Also, back to that word proper. Proper is one of those words that has a really particular connotation in a lot of settings that is about class, right? There's a proper way to do things and there's an improper way to do things. And when you don't know the proper way, you are betraying that you are not from a a certain class. The sharing of the story of being followed around a fancy store as a teenager by this older white person is essentially coming back to that micro invalidation, saying that, you know, those three terms, micro assault, micro insult, micro invalidation. This is a classic micro invalidation. And it is saying, we have the same experience. I was followed around as a teenager, so this can't be about race. It's definitely about age. In which case, right, it is possible that that is true. It is unlikely that that is true, but it also does not mean that their experiences are the same. And it is improper to equate the two. And the last thing, I think it is really important for us in thinking critically about how things appear to people. The young person said no really explicitly. They did not want to write about this experience. And so first of all, ignoring this young person's agency to say, no, I'm not interested in writing about this. And then saying, oh, but this is such a powerful experience. One, microaggressions are daily and they happen often. So it's not really a powerful experience, right? It may be a powerful experience for that white person who does not experience it on a regular basis, but it's not a powerful experience for this young person of color who experiences these things on a regular and daily basis. But what it does say to this young person when being asked to write about it for their daily writing session is that your only value to us right now is when you write about your trauma, right? Like, oh, this is a powerful experience because you're writing about your trauma, which when we think about how that influences trends and what that means for media consumption and what stories get told and what stories don't get told, I just want to be thoughtful about how when we think about Black media that's been made over the last 10 or 15 years and the films that have won prestigious awards, or when we think about literature that has been written by people of color, any kind of media that has been written by marginalized community members often involves trauma. It involves people holding marginalized identities, talking about their pain and their suffering, and these are the things that are rewarded. And so the experiences that the world sees of people of color or people who hold marginalized identities is less holistic, right? We don't get to hear about the whole life of people who hold marginalized identities. We don't get to hear about their joy and their love and their success and we get to hear about their triumph over adversity. We get to hear about their trauma. We get to hear about their pain, but we don't get to see them as real and total whole people because those are not the experiences that are rewarded by modern media. So even though it sounds like I'm being nitpicky in talking about this, people of color are only valuable when they write about their trauma in this like one small daily writing session, what that turns out to mean in a larger and broader context is actually really impactful. And I just want to note that. It's 11:50. I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I want to see what is going to be most impactful for us. I can run us through really quickly different kinds of microaggressions. I can like speed read us through this and say, okay, there are like different types of microaggressions like being an alien in one's own land or being criminalized because of poverty or things like that. If that would be useful to you, because this is a collaborative learning environment. If it would be useful for us to do another scenario, or if it would be useful for me to offer you ways to interrupt microaggressions, or if it would be useful for you all to ask questions, we have 10 minutes. What would be most useful for you? Would it be useful for you to be able to ask questions and for me to answer? Like, for instance, if you have been in a meeting where something happened and you want to say, and you want to ask, I'm not really sure how this could have been addressed. Do you have suggestions on how I could have said something in the moment or how I could have sent an email afterwards or et cetera? I'm happy to answer those questions for you. If you would rather go through a scenario, I want to be flexible about what is most useful for our time and what is most impactful for you. Interrupting. All right. I have 3 interruptings, 1 scenario. So let's go to interrupting. These are broad and general tools. I will just say, when I talk about these things, like, we're doing deep work here, right? You're going to be doing this for the rest of your life. I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life. I would also just like to say that everyone perpetuates microaggressions in some way or form or another. This is not just like, white people are not the only people who are doing microaggressions. I'm doing microaggressions. You're doing microaggressions. We're all doing microaggressions on a daily basis because there are people who hold differing identities from us that we're not thinking about them. And I want to say the people who suffer from the most microaggressions that people do not recognize and do not think about, because we don't talk about disability justice often, are people who have disabilities. So when we're thinking about microaggressions, I think often we're talking about racial microaggressions because those are so visible to us right now. But microaggressions happen across gender, across race, across spectrum. There are so many identities that are impacted by microaggressions. So I'm going to go back to sharing so that we can go back to talking about how we interrupt these and how we make changes in our own behavior and notice them. Thank you for holding with me while I click. So, interrupting microaggressions, some really key kinds of behaviors that we cultivate in ourselves and that we cultivate in the environments that we are in. 1, reflection on your own attitude, stereotype, and expectations. I think about this kind of as the now what step, right? Is that like, now you know microaggressions exist. Now you've maybe done some work thinking about where your belief systems came from. So for instance, I'm from Vermont. It is a particularly white state. I didn't grow up around many other people of color, just my family. And so when I moved to New York City for the first time, I was suddenly confronted with people of color in a way that I never had been. And I committed microaggressions all the time. I held deeply racist behaviors about things that I was not even aware of. And so that reflection and understanding has now, I haven't lived in Vermont for almost 20 years, full time. Now I'm back in Vermont, but that reflection, that self-awareness is probably the most important component that I have worked on in order to be more mindful about how I behave with other folks. Confront your own hesitance. This is incredibly important work. You have to be in it. And if you're hesitating, why are you hesitating? Wondering and confronting that is really important. One of my favorite writers, her name is Roxane Gay. She has this great quote. She was once asked if she would ever be a sensitivity reader for anyone, which is essentially somebody who reads through writing to say, oh, this is racist, don't put that in there, or this is, harmful or prejudiced or whatever. And she said, no, I would never do that. I would never be a sensitivity reader. And when she was asked why, she said, well, first of all, Black people are not a monolith. So I could never tell you what another Black person finds offensive. I can only tell you what I find offensive. So the concept of sensitivity reading is crazy to me because we're all our own different people. So you can't expect anyone who holds one minority identity to be an expert on any experience beyond their own. And they certainly cannot speak to the experience of any group of people that they are a part of. Here's a really helpful and practical one, because I think that this is one that you can put into practice all the time. If you are making a blanket claim about a group of people or a group of people that hold an identity, imagine that someone who holds that identity is standing right next to you. In some way, that person is reflected or represented when you are talking about them. If that changes the way that you would talk about them, that is something to note. It's really helpful for you to say, if I was going to be talking, for instance, like I'm Pakistani. If I was going to be talking about Pakistanis in some way or another, and I had a Pakistani person standing right next to me and I would change the way that I was discussing Pakistanis, that means that I should probably examine why I would change the way that I'm talking about them. In cases where people have had the courage to point out that they were offended by something, it is so much more important for you to just listen than it is for you to reflect back to them, than it is for you to take immediate action, to over apologize. It's just, you can reflect on what happened later. Simple, I'm going to think about what you said and get back to you. You don't have to apologize immediately. You can take time to process things. All of those things are acceptable behaviors, right? It takes courage to be able to, it's incredibly vulnerable to say, hey, this happened in a conversation or a meeting or an email, and I want to let you know that it offended or bothered or hurt me. That's an incredible level of trust that someone has given you, to say that to you, to have a relationship with you, to offer that kind of opportunity for repair. So if you take that as the gift that it is, you are now being offered an opportunity to build a deeper relationship with that person. And by taking time to listen and respond in a way that is not defensive or immediately, by making it about yourself, you are taking that gift in the spirit with which it has been given. So those are the things you can do for yourself. On behalf of others, establishing standards of responsibility and behavior for working collectively with others. This really just means if you work in an organization where you don't have a clear set of conduct codes for what happens when racist behavior, sexist behavior, classist behavior, et cetera, take place, everyone should know what happens next. If someone makes a comment that is inappropriate, what are the next steps of action that take place? Do you have an immediate meeting with your supervisor? Do you have some kind of action or penalty that happens with HR? What is your collective understanding of what the process looks like? And the reason that this is so important is because when people understand that there is a process that you are engaged in, when something happens that is inappropriate, people are less likely to engage in that kind of behavior. Challenging discriminatory attitudes and behavior rather than the person. We talked about this earlier. When people feel personally attacked, they are much less likely to change a behavior. When you ask someone to reflect upon a behavior rather than who they are as a person, they are much more likely to be open to hearing your perspective or belief or opinion or offering to change a behavior or an attitude. Impact more important than intent. This is kind of a concept that is used throughout equity, right? Throughout equity work in general, which is that we often get caught up in worrying about whether or not we are right, rather than whether or not we have been good. And so I really like to focus, I would much rather be kind than right. It is much more important for me to be a person who is kind and generous and giving than it is for me to be a person who is understood and good and right. So impact, much more important than intent. You can always know what your intent was. Other people can never know that. But you always know what your impact is on someone else, especially if they have the courage to tell you. In the moment, it is very possible for you to stop unintentional micro insults, microaggressions, micro invalidations, not by pointing out that people have made a mistake, but by just asking them to rephrase it or rethink it. Hey, I'm not sure if you meant to say it this way, but a reframing of that might be this instead. That's it. It doesn't have to be kind of like a moral judgment or a lesson. It could just be, here's another offering for this if you want it. And then being educated so that you can provide accurate information to challenge stereotypes or biases, really important. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. It is 12 o'clock. I did my best to end us on time. I deeply, deeply appreciate how you all show up to these sessions, and I know that these conversations bring up a lot of emotions, and I appreciate that you show up anyway. So thank you for spending some time with me this morning, and thank you for inviting me back.
Thank you so much for everything. That was a great presentation. If you guys have any questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat, or you can reach out directly or to me, and I can come to Sultana. But thank you all for joining, and we will be in contact about the Lunch and Learn for May, since it does overlap with a breastfeeding training. So just be on the lookout for that. So thank you all. I hope you have a great day. Bye.
Thank you for coming.
Sultana, I have a quick question if you don't mind.
Sure.
I was curious what